Today on Blue 58, the Packers are so close to something approximating actual football. What should we be watching on Saturday?
Blue 58!
Hello and welcome to another episode of Blue 58, the one and only podcast of thepowersweep.com. I'm your host, John Meerdink, and I'm happy to be with you here for another episode because the next time we talk, we're going to have almost a real football game to talk about. That's pretty exciting, right? It feels exciting. It is exciting. It's exciting to see preseason stuff go down. Even if you don't get a chance to watch it live, it's fun to run through the highlights and see what goes on with somebody running around a football field wearing a Green Bay Packers uniform. That's what we're going to see Saturday night on top of everything else. That's really our first look. So run a little preseason stuff for yourself. Make sure you get your snacks in order, whatever you like to have during a game. Walk yourself through the preseason. See if you want to try anything new. Maybe this is the time of year where you want to try something different before you get into the regular season. We've got 3 of these games to work through in non-traditional time slots, which is good because in week 1, the Packers are starting off on a Friday night. So if you want to practice getting used to non-traditional time slots for Packers games, well, this is a perfect opportunity. So let's do that. We're going to talk a little bit about what to be looking for in Saturday night's game. But first, a couple topics I want to touch on here. First, the Packers are shuffling things around on their roster. A couple different workouts this week. Bunch of different guys coming through Green Bay, resulting in 3 signings. The first 2, pretty standard stuff here. Zach Morton and Brevin Allen are 2 defensive ends, probably edge rusher types. They'd be outside linebackers in our old 3-4 system. Now they're defensive linemen, defensive ends in the 4-3. Morton, a 6'4", 260-pound prospect out of Akron, 9.32 relative athletic score, really well-rounded too. Didn't really coast on like the strength of a couple drills or something, or just being unusually big and putting up middling numbers beyond that. He didn't really put those numbers to much use in college, though, a career production ratio of 0.53, which is not really what we're looking for a guy who is super-duper athletic and playing against MAC-level competition. I mean, we were high on Carl Brooks last year for how he dominated, put up good numbers playing at Bowling Green. Well, Morton was playing in the same conference and was not doing spectacular things like Brooks was. Morton signed with the Lions as a 2023 undrafted free agent. Didn't end up making their roster or the practice squad, was in the UFL for last season and now finds himself in Green Bay as the Packers are dealing with a couple of minor injuries on their defensive line. Brevin Allen joins him as well, 6'3", 265 pounds. Again, not super big for an edge rusher. Played his college football at Campbell, the home of the Fighting Camels of the Coastal Athletic Association. What could be better than that? The first fighting camel to play in an NFL game. Middle-of-the-road athlete, 6'4", relative athletic score, did not do agility drills, which is a real shame because, as we all know,
it's about the cones.
2023 undrafted free agent for the Chargers last year, appeared in their first 2 games last season and then no more for the rest of the year. 12 snaps on defense in those 2 games, 18 on special teams. No notable statistics beyond that, really. The Packers just looking for a little bit of depth there. Then we've got Alex Hale. Hale's a kicker. Originally from Australia, played his most notable college football at Oklahoma State. Fairly well-recognized kicker, too. A Groza Award finalist in both 2020 and 2023. Was the 8th-ranked kicker in this year's Beast from Dane Brugler. Completely blanked on his name there for a second. But their 8th-ranked kicker, Brugler's 8th-ranked kicker, was 1 spot ahead of James Turner, who was with the Packers for a little while during training camp. Interesting note here that the Packers are signing a kicker going back up to 3 in their kicker competition, just as it looks like Greg Joseph is starting to create a little bit of distance between himself and Anders Carlson. His accuracy or his overall performance over the course of training camp has been trending upward as Carlson tails off just a little bit here. But despite that, the Packers have brought in a 3rd kicker, and we don't really have an explanation for that yet, other than what we can make up ourselves. But I think we could draw a couple conclusions here. First, this isn't just a one-off deal. The Packers have been shuffling through 3rd kickers all offseason now. They had Jack Podlesny, and James Turner, and now Alex Hale bringing their total up to now 5 kickers they've had on the roster at some point this year. They've been consistently trying to look at it as many different kickers as they can. Secondly, I think it does show us that Joseph, though maybe improving a little bit, improving his odds against Carlson, is not out of the woods yet, and neither is Carlson here. And thirdly, I think it's not completely impossible that the Packers, the guy who does the bulk of the kicking for the Packers this year, I don't think we're talking about week 1 or an early season replacement here, but I think it's possible that the guy who does the bulk of the kicking for the Packers this year may not yet be on the roster. I think we're going to be in a situation where this kicker battle, such as it is going to extend into the regular season. And if whoever ends up winning the initial job here, whether it's Greg Joseph or Carlson or Hale or somebody else, should not be considering that job over. They're going to have to continue to be solid and reliable pretty much all year long, or I think the Packers are going to look to make a change as they continue to shuffle this around. So the Packers may be just building a ready list here. They may be looking for somebody who could come in if somebody like Joseph falters or Carlson falters once they get to the regular season. Or maybe it's really kind of like the Daniel Whelan situation last year, where Whelan was not like a super big contender for the roster, but just hung around, and all of a sudden, well, look, he's younger and cheaper than Pat O'Donnell. He might have a bigger leg. They just go with Whelan. Maybe they do something weird like that. But this does happen from time to time at positions where things are a little bit in flux. It's possible that the guy who ends up doing the job is not on the roster here even on the 8th of August. Wouldn't be the first time, and it's going to be far from the last, and this is going to be a storyline to watch for the Packers this year. In any case, we might want to just resign ourselves to not having terrific performance from the Packers kickers this year. I don't want to be super doom and gloom, but that seems like a fairly likely outcome here, that we're not going to have just a lights-out kicker start to finish this season. This might be a multi-year fix. Second topic I wanted to get to before we've talked about Saturday's preseason game, some injury scares in Green Bay. Some more severe than others, but the Packers have now seen somewhat noteworthy moments with Jordan Morgan, Christian Watson, and Jordan Love. Jaden Reed has also missed some time. Edgerrin Cooper's been missing time for a while. Carrington Valentine's been missing a little bit of time here. It's coming. The big one's coming. Something always breaks loose. Maybe poor choice of words there. Something always happens injury-wise that ends up affecting a team's roster. Prepare yourself for that to happen. And truthfully, if we want to reframe that a little bit, that's a part of the appeal of watching the sport, not seeing guys get hurt, but as a fan, watching what happens after the bad thing happens is part of the interesting process of this game. What happens when things don't go well? How do teams handle that? Who rises to the occasion and who doesn't? How do coaches deal with having somebody important not available? I'm not saying the inevitable injury stuff is a good thing, because it's not. If I could, I'd do it Madden style or college football style and just turn off injuries for the whole league. It's not good for the league. It's not good for the team. It's not good for fans ultimately to have those injuries. But injuries are often how interesting things happen, and they often have long-running repercussions for franchises. This is maybe not a good example of something good happening as a result of an injury, but think how long and how much the injury to Sam Shields in Week 1 of the 2016 season affected the Packers. So heading into 2016, the Packers have two young corners in Quentin Rollins and Demarius Randall, along with Sam Shields in their secondary. They've got Ladarius Gunter, who's a promising undrafted free agent as well, though he needs to be in a small role. And then in Week 1, Sam Shields gets a concussion and never plays another game for the Packers again. Over the course of that year, Randall has some up and down stuff, as was the entire Demarius Randall experience. Quentin Rollins pretty much proves that he can't play in the NFL, and Ladarius Gunter ends up playing a bunch of reps for the Packers, and he does his best. I've joked many times that we're going to put on his tombstone, here lies Ladarius Gunter, he tried his best, but his best was not very good. Famously, he got worked over really well, really good, by Julio Jones in the 2016 NFC Championship game, including if you're a Falcons fan, a fairly iconic play where there's a great picture of it, but just Jones just obliterating Ladarius Gunter, just driving him into the turf and then racing off for a touchdown. That was bad, obviously, but the previous week, it was Ladarius Gunter matched up against Dez Bryant in Dallas, and Bryant had a field day as well. You don't remember that as much because the Packers ended up winning that game, but Gunter was victimized again and again and again by Ladarius Gunter because they had nobody else to put on him because the rest of the secondary had fallen apart. And then what happens the next spring? Well, the Packers have some needs at edge rusher and some needs at cornerback. And as the first round breaks and unfolds in the 2017 NFL draft, it looks like the Packers have two pretty good options toward the end of the first round. So what do? They trade out of the first round and end up selecting Kevin King at the top of the second round. Well, obviously there's been some repercussions to that there as well. And I know I'm not making anybody feel better as far as injuries talk goes, but the point is that part of what makes following the sport interesting is what happens as a result of those injuries and who rises to an occasion and stuff like that. Here's a positive example. We remember Brian Bulaga as a longtime successful NFL tackle for the Packers. He had injury issues of his own. Mark Tauscher actually had his career overlap with Brian Bulaga, and Bulaga did not take over as a starter as a rookie in 2010 until Mark Tauscher ended up tearing his knee during that 2010 regular season. So Tauscher steps out of the lineup, Bulaga steps in, ends up being a successful player for the Packers. Early 2013, Brian Bulaga has switched to left tackle. The Packers did an unusual thing to start that season. They basically flip-flopped their left side of their offensive line and right side of their offensive line. So Brian Bulaga and Josh Sitton move over to the left side. TJ Lang moves over to the right side, and they try to go from there. Well, what happens in the family night scrimmage in 2013, the very last family night scrimmage ever? Well, Brian Bulaga tears up his knee. And who steps in? David Bakhtiari. A year later, David Bakhtiari is the unquestioned starter at left tackle. And at right tackle, you have Brian Bulaga. It ends up stabilizing the Packers' offensive line. That same year, 2014, what happens? J.C. Tretter is set to start for the Packers at center. Late in training camp, he gets injured. Who steps in? Corey Linsley. Very short notice, ends up being the Packers' starting center, never hands the job back to Tretter, who ends up playing guard and tackle for the Packers over the remainder of his NFL career. Injuries have a way of shaping rosters in unusual ways, and it's going to happen to the Packers this year because it happens to every team every year. It's part of the game, and it's going to happen to the Packers eventually. So let's see how it ends up shaping this team. So, we're 13 minutes in. Let's talk preseason football here. What do we want to watch for in this first preseason game with the Packers this year? I think we can sort our watch list into three tiers. The top level, just overall team stuff. The unit level, offense, defense, and special teams. And then the individual player levels. What players are we going to be watching in this first preseason game? Top level stuff, just let's start with some vibes. What sort of feeling does this team give you? It's easy to look at stuff in training camp and get excited. That's part of what training camp is for. You get everybody excited about the team. Everything looks great in training camp. Every team always looks like a world beater in training camp unless you're really, really going to be dismal that year. And sometimes that happens. But for the Packers and for most teams that have a shot at being fairly decent, your team's going to look good in training camp. That's part of what it's for. You want to see your team coming together, feeling good, looking good as you head towards the start of the regular season. Once you get to actual competition with another team, how does that feeling change? What do you get from this team? Maybe it's good, maybe it's bad, maybe it looks like it's going to be a little bit rough. Maybe that ends up being inaccurate, but checking in on that early feeling is never a bad idea. Does this team in their very first impressions look like they have it together, or maybe not so much? That's, I think, a fair question to ask once we see the Packers in action against the Browns this Saturday. At the unit level, let's start on offense. First, on offense, on the offensive line, who starts and who is the first off the bench? The Packers have some injury stuff going on with the offensive line here. They may not play everybody who's a potential starter on their offensive line here. I would be surprised if everybody was out there to start in this first preseason game. But it'll be interesting to see who starts and who is the first off the bench. Who do the Packers turn to when they need somebody to fill in today or Saturday? Today, actually, Thursday in practice, according to reports from PackersNews.com. I don't know whose name was on it. But Sean Ryan had a bit of a misstep early in practice, and with Jordan Morgan out, the Packers turned to rookie Jacob Monk to take snaps with the first-team offense after Ryan's mess-up. So Ryan gets the first opportunity with the first team. As soon as he makes a mistake, the Packers go to Jacob Monk. What sort of situations like that will play out with the Packers on Saturday? Same kind of deal at wide receiver. I want to see who lines up when and where. Who are the Packers' first options at wide receiver, presumably with guys like Christian Watson and Jaden Reed not playing a whole ton of reps here after some injury stuff with them this week. So who takes their spots, and when do they change over, and where are those guys playing? Because there are different roles in the Packers offense. Every NFL team has their X and Z receivers, but also their slot guys. Who is playing each of those roles, when, and how much? That's worth considering. As we're trying to figure out what these roles are, who is playing them and when will help us figure that out. I'm specifically looking at the slot here to see if we get any sort of surprise slot appearances. That's an interesting skill set to be able to have, and if the Packers want to get an extended look at somebody who maybe hasn't done that a whole lot before, this would be the time we can see if something like that happens. Finally, if and when Jordan Love goes out of this game, I'm assuming he's not going to play this whole game, can the Packers move the ball with him out? At some point, they're going to get somebody some reps with basically the starting offense, but without Jordan Love on the field. Can the Packers move the ball in those situations, whether it's Sean Clifford or Michael Pratt? Can they move the ball with those guys out? This might be a longer-term question, maybe for preseason game 2 or 3, but can the Packers move the ball without their starting quarterback out there? Of note, and something to watch every year. On defense, we're looking at some rotation things too, starting with the early linebacker rotation. The Packers have some injuries there. Edgerrin Cooper, in particular, is a little bit dinged up. So who's going to end up playing a lot? Presumably that would be Tyron Hopper, but if Eric Wilson is playing a bunch, that may be worth noting too. My feeling, if you look at the depth chart right now, when they have guys like Eric Wilson, let's just use that one for example. The Packers have Eric Wilson as their one of their 3 starting linebackers in their base defense right now. I'm probably a bigger Eric Wilson fan than most, and I would even argue that that's pretty fake. If the Packers go into week 1 with Wilson as one of their 3 base starting linebackers with a first-round pick, a second-round pick, a third-round pick, and Isaiah McDuffie, who's played a lot of snaps on defense for them on the roster, something has gone wrong there. There is a missed eval, or somebody has been, I guess, too hurt to contribute, but Eric Wilson should probably not be your default starting linebacker at any of your 3 spots, and I like, again, Eric Wilson a lot. So who's going to play a lot that could be potentially one of those 3 week 1 starters there? Worth noting and checking in on. Safety, same kind of deal here. I feel like we've got a pretty good idea who the Packers' top 2 safeties are right now. But if there's a situation where one of those guys is either unavailable or you want to go with a slightly different matchup, who gets in there first and when? Is Evan Williams as firmly behind Javon Bullard as it looks like right now, or are they going to be as interchangeable as they were in early training camp? I think it's like 7 of 12 practices now that Bullard has been one of the starters, or been the starter, maybe even higher than that. Might have been 7 in a row after. I'm trying to recall something I just read in passing like 20 minutes before I recorded here. But Bullard seems to have solidified a hold on one of those 2 starting safety jobs. How firm is that hold, though, and who's going to play the most snaps may remain to be seen. So let's see who ends up playing the most at those spots. And when it's Bullard and Williams on the field together, does that look like a pretty decent combo? Does it look like a situation where if Xavier McKinney was out, the Packers would be bereft of options again at safety like they have been so frequently in the recent past? That would be not ideal. given the resources the Packers have sunk into their safeties this year. And then when the guys are on the field, what did they actually do? How does Jeff Hafley use his safety? I'm not under any impressions that we're going to get some sort of insight into how this defense works through one preseason game, but we'll get something. What does he actually do with his safeties when they're on the field? Finally, the defensive line. They've got some depth questions there, and this will tie into somebody I want to keep an eye on defense here in a second. But I would suspect most of the top-end guys are not really going to play. So I wouldn't expect to see a lot from Kenny Clark or Devontae Wyatt or even TJ Slayton. So what do things look like behind them? How do Colby Wooden and Carl Brooks factor into this? What are their roles look like in this year's defense? At the player level, there's a few guys, 3 on offense, 3 on defense, that I want to keep an eye on here in this early preseason slate. On offense, I want to start with Josh Jacobs. Matt LaFleur said this week that he wants to see how Jacobs looks in pads and in live tackling and all that. I want to see it too. Just give me a vibe check here on Josh Jacobs. Is this going to look like a good signing right out of the gate, or is it going to look like we signed a guy whose best football might be behind him? I think there's good reason to think that that he still has some good years ahead of him, but people are wary about signing running backs of his age for good reason. So we'll see what ends up happening there, but we might get an early impression one way or another this week if Jacobs ends up playing. Secondly, Grant DuBose. I want to keep an eye on him. He has made a bit of a push on the roster for a roster spot during training camp here. Things are pretty tough ahead of him. He's got some tough sledding ahead of him. The top four as well as I do in some order. Christian Watson, Jaden Reed, Dontavian Wicks, and Romeo Doubs. Beyond that, you've got Bo Melton, Malik Heath, and Grant DuBose fighting for maybe 2 spots. That's pretty tough. And to get past 2 guys that played significant roles for the Packers at points last year in Heath and DuBose, that demands a pretty intense push here. Can he do it? It remains to be seen. But we'll get a look at him on Saturday night. Finally, on offense, I just want to see Kadeem Telfort play. How legit has this Kadeem Telfort getting first-team reps thing been? Because that's quite a jump, even as someone who was a fan of Telfort basically from the get-go. We ID'd him coming out of the 2023 draft season as potentially an interesting undrafted free agent going forward. And it looks like he is walking the path that several guys before him have walked, kind of in that giant tackle scholarship program that we've talked about a little bit over the past couple of years. The Packers kept him around all last year on the practice squad, never really made a serious push for the 53 throughout last season. They didn't have him up for a couple games or anything like that. But now he's getting first-team reps at right tackle ahead of Andre Dillard with Zach Tom out. How real is that? What does it look like when he's playing against another actual NFL team in an 11-on-11 situation? Let's find out. I'm interested to see. On defense, let's start with Brenton Cox. He's at the top of my defensive watch list right now. The Packers are signing defensive ends because they need depth. Rashawn Gary should not be playing tons of reps. You know what you're getting out of Rashawn Gary. He doesn't need the practice. He's ready to go. Lucas Van Ness, probably about the same sort of deal. Nobody's taking his roster spot. Maybe he gets more reps just because somebody's got to take them. And if Rashawn Gary's not going to do it, it might end up being Lucas Van Ness. Same sort of thing goes with Preston Smith. He's in year 75 as an NFL player. He does not need preseason practice. You know what you're getting out of Preston Smith, and hopefully he knows what he needs to get ready for the regular season. What does he need to do to get his body ready to play for week 1? Hopefully he's done that by now. That means that there are some opportunities available, and with the Packers a little bit dinged up further down their defensive end depth chart, somebody like Brenton Cox has an opportunity here. Can he take advantage? At linebacker, let's see what Tyron Hopper can give us. What do the Packers see that few draft analysts, the Packers aren't draft analysts, they're actually drafting. What did the Packers see that most people didn't seem to see in Tyron Hopper that made him, they said they had a second-round grade on him. What did they see that fits with that sort of profile? Let's see if we can see what the Packers saw as he lines up against some NFL competition here. And then finally, to round it out, I want to see what we see out of Evan Williams. He's been one of the most interesting, I think, defensive stories in training camp so far. A fairly lightly regarded prospect when the Packers picked him, but he seems to be making plays consistently throughout training camp. Seems like a really smart player. Could be an interesting movable piece for Jeff Hafley. And let's see what he does in actual competition this weekend. How does he do when it's live in an unfamiliar kind of environment? Let's see what he does. And finally, since I forgot to talk about it in the unit level conversation, special teams. What do we get out of the kickers? What does Daniel Whelan do as a punter? And what are the Packers actually going to show in this new kickoff rule setup situation? I've kind of landed on this idea that the Packers and probably the rest of the NFL aren't really going to show anything in terms of their strategies for kickoff return type stuff. During the preseason, I think we're going to head into week one and see what teams are really trying to do or what their real actual plans are. But in the meantime, what do the Packers do when they're trying to maybe disguise their actual intentions a little bit here? And what does it look like? It'll be fun to see. It'll be fun to see what this actual kickoff thing looks like in practice, because as I've said a few times over the years on this podcast, my favorite team is the Packers. My second favorite team is chaos. This is pretty chaotic. This is pretty wild and crazy. We're introducing an entirely new procedure to this game with very little actual play testing. Well, I guess technically no play testing before they started using it in preseason games. Other than what happened in the USFL or the XFL, they're just kind of going with it, and teams are figuring it out on the fly. That's pretty cool. That's not something you see a whole lot. In fact, I can't recall another situation quite like that, except for other tweaks to the kickoff over the years that's really introduced that kind of change. So what do the Packers end up doing long term, and what does it look like in the short term? That's going to be fun to see. It's going to be fun. Have fun with it. Don't take it too serious. It's just preseason football. It's practice for us too. Let's enjoy what we've got. There's only so many of these games every year, preseason or otherwise. You don't get to see your Green Bay Packers on a football field in uniform doing stuff that often. Enjoy it. Just have fun with it. Have fun, as much fun as you can. Find your own thing to enjoy about it, and then let's reconvene next week and see what we thought. That's all I've got for you in this episode of Blue 58. I appreciate you tuning in. I'd appreciate it even more if you'd take a second and share this episode with someone you think would enjoy it. That's going to help more people find the show and get more people involved in this conversation you and I are having about the Green Bay Packers, which in turn is going to help all of us, me included, become smarter Packers fans. And as I always say, smarter Packers fans are better Packers fans, and better Packers fans are what we all want to be. I'm your host, John Meerdink. We'll see you next time on Blue 58.